Hi everyone, it's Katrina. The flooded tomb. Tombs aren't always filled with untold riches of gold and silver. Sometimes they're filled with mummy soup. Archaeologist John Ward discovered the entrance to a mysterious chamber in Egypt's Gebel el-Silsila. John was positive that this strange entrance was going to lead to something amazing. The issue was that the hidden chamber was completely filled with mucky water. It took a lot of money and a lot of hard work, but John and his team were able to pump all the water out of the chamber so that they could crawl inside. And after worming their way through the narrow entrance, John and his team came into a forgotten tomb where they made a gruesome discovery. They were suddenly wading through what the researchers described as human soup. John Ward drained a flooded tomb, but somehow he didn't consider the fact that all the bodies buried inside of it had been festering in the water for hundreds, even thousands of years. They couldn't get all the water out of the tomb, so the researchers had to wade through a disgusting stew of groundwater and mummified human remains. The ancient tomb was used about 3,500 years ago to bury upwards of 50 people. Researchers did make some cool discoveries, though. They found a few sarcophagi in the main chamber. One contained the remains of a child, while the other held an infant. These haven't been fully studied yet, so the history of the buried dead is still unknown. The biggest issue is that all the remains are jumbled because of the flood. So it's going to take years to reach the deepest recesses of the tomb because of the water, and to sort out who all the floating bones belong to. And now for number 8. But first, I want to give a huge shout out to Jared Quinney and Carlos Garcia. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained practically since the beginning. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. A real magic wand. In northern Syria, archaeologists discovered a real magic wand that was used 9,000 years ago. The magic wand was extraordinarily creepy because it had 2 human faces carved into it. Not only that, but the wand was found in a graveyard. And not just any graveyard, it was a cemetery where 30 people were found without their heads. Every single thing about this discovery is beyond freaky. Experts are thinking the wand was likely used as part of a bizarre burial ritual, perhaps even to summon supernatural beings. Whatever the case may be, the wand definitely had something to do with the 30 headless skeletons. Frank Bramer, an archaeologist out of France, described the discovery as highly unusual and unique. The human faces carved into the wand are some of the only naturalistic depictions of human faces from 9,000 years ago. The site itself, the headless graveyard, was excavated in southern Syria at a place called Tel Karasa. The bodies were buried underneath an artificial mound that had been built up over thousands of years. Other discoveries at the site include evidence of early farmers. These were people who ate goats and grew chickpeas. They were some of the first farmers in the world and were apparently obsessed with death and magic. Experts believe the faces on the wand may have been representations of ancestors, and the ritual may have been an attempt to resurrect the spirits of those who died long ago. The Necro Pants. How would you like to have wealth beyond your imagination and enough goat milk to last a lifetime? It sounds like a pretty good bargain, but only if you can stomach the rituals required. If you lived in Iceland in the 17th century, you may have tried the Necro Pants to acquire untold wealth. Iceland was a miserable place to live in the 17th century because of pirate attacks, disasters, and diseases. People resorted to any means necessary to improve their lives, and this often meant they participated in extremely weird magical ceremonies. Let's talk about the Necro Pants. For unlimited wealth, one needed to create a pair of pants known as nabrok. To do this, a sorcerer needed to make a pact with a friend. The friend must agree that upon their death, the sorcerer could take possession of their skin from the waist down. After the friend died of natural causes, and keep in mind it needed to be natural causes, not murder, the magician could harvest their skin. But they couldn't create any holes or tears while doing so. If they did, the spell would be ruined. When all was said and done, the sorcerer had a pair of pants made from the skin of their dead friend. They could then put those pants on, but the ceremony wasn't over just yet. The rest of the ritual was just as weird as the first part. The sorcerer needed to steal a coin from a sad widow, and some magical symbols needed to be drawn on parchment. The coin was then placed inside the pants, at which point they would start filling with coins. This would result in the wearer of the pants having access to unlimited money. Whether the spell worked or not is unknown. It's scientifically impossible, but who's to say which magic is real and which isn't? The only known pair of Necro Pants are currently being stored at the Museum of Icelandic Sorcery and Witchcraft. The pants aren't made of real skin, but the artifact is a realistic reproduction of what Necro Pants would have looked like 400 years ago. Poisoned book covers. During the medieval days, books could kill. Not only were there plenty of creepy grimoires floating around with spells promising to put you into contact with demons, there were also books that were physically poisonous. 3 rare books were discovered at the University of Southern Denmark, and they were found to contain large concentrations of arsenic. The books were published around the 16th century, and somebody slathered the covers with enough arsenic to potentially kill someone. Scientists made the discovery using various tests, including X-ray fluorescence analysis and micro-XRF technology. They only looked into the books because of the strange green pigment found on the covers. Scientists were curious to see what it was, though nobody had expected to find arsenic. Arsenic is one of the most toxic things in the world. Exposure to the poison can lead to cancer and other fatal conditions, but the stuff was used heavily in the 19th century in paints. Painters covered their masterpieces in a poisonous substance without even realizing it. Nobody figured out that arsenic was killing people until the middle of the 20th century. The books from the Middle Ages likely weren't designed to be poisonous. Whoever published the books probably used arsenic in the paint for their covers, but they hadn't intended to accidentally give whoever handled the book cancer and make them sick. Creepy Titanic. Robert Ballard, the retired Navy officer who discovered the wreckage of the Titanic, recently revealed his most haunting memory from the expedition. He was part of the team that uncovered the remains of the Titanic in 1985. Robert said the creepiest thing that he saw while looking through the wreckage were the shoes. Lots and lots of shoes were scattered in the debris field, and Robert couldn't help but think about how they were previously on the feet of the victims. When the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, over 1,500 people lost their lives. Many of those people tumbled off the Titanic as it snapped in half and was sucked into the ocean. In the debris field, their bodies gathered in a ghoulish mass grave. Animals quickly got rid of their bodies, then their bones dissolved in the deep ocean. It likely took about 5 years before not a single trace of them was left, except for the clothes they were wearing. When Robert Ballard explored the ruins of the Titanic for the first time, he kept seeing shoes. He looked into the dark confines of a second-class cabin, where Robert found a pair of adult women's shoes next to a pair of young girls' shoes. It was a disturbing snapshot of a mother who died with her daughter as the ship sank. The ancient brain tumor. In Spain, archaeologists just unearthed a rather beaten skull from the Roman era. The skull bears the scars of great violence and something unusual beneath. Researchers think whoever the skull belonged to may have suffered from a brain tumor. The skull was discovered during a caving expedition in the north of the country. The person died sometime between 258 and 409 AD. He was between the ages of 30 and 40 when he perished, with evidence of lesions across his skull prior to his death. It looks like he was attacked once or more, hit by something that left marks across his cranium. Researchers also found a lesion on his skull that looks like it was from a tumor. If true, this would be the first known case of an ancient skeleton with such a brain tumor in the region. But what could have given a person a brain tumor 2,000 years ago? Scientists aren't sure. They aren't even fully convinced the lesion is proof of a brain tumor. They compared the lesion with modern scarring from meningioma and it matches. But it's still only a theory. Either way, brain tumor or not, this Roman had a seriously hard life, and people kept beating him over the head. The mummy girlfriend. If you've ever felt desperate to get a girlfriend, you can rest easy knowing you've never been as desperate as the man who stole an 800-year-old mummy and made it his girlfriend. In a shocking case that just unfolded in Peru, Julio Cesar Bermejo was busted for some truly creepy crimes. Julio used to be a food delivery driver, but he was caught by the cops drinking alcohol at the archaeological site of Montaro, and when the police looked through his bag, which he used to deliver food, they found the shriveled remains of a mummy. Julio then confessed that the mummy was his girlfriend and normally slept in bed next to him. The mummy was wrapped in bandages and was frozen in the fetal position. The body was so small and compressed it easily fit in the cooler bag. Julio named her Juanita, calling her his spiritual girlfriend. But just where did this guy get a mummy? Apparently, it was already in his family. Julio admitted that his father gave him the mummy as a present because it had been in the family for about 3 decades. The family thought they'd donate it to a museum, but Julio said he wanted to keep it. Nobody realized, though, that he was sleeping in his bed with it. The police confiscated the mummy, which will be given to the proper authorities. Nobody knows where it came from, only that it was likely taken from somewhere in the Peruvian Andes. It could also be anywhere between 600 and 800 years old, dating to before the Inca Empire. Sinister Painting. Jenny Stevenson and her family were staying at a secluded bed and breakfast in Sweden when they made a bizarre discovery on the wall. The family was on their way home from a ski trip and stopped at the B&B to rest. They'd just arrived when Jenny's daughter noticed a peculiar painting. She said to her mother, "Hey, there's a picture of Barney on the wall." And sure enough, the painting was of a young child that looked identical to Jenny's youngest boy named Barney, not the dinosaur. It wasn't just coincidental in the way that 2 children may look the same because they're young. They really looked identical. The whole family was shocked because the kid in the painting appeared to be their son Barney's doppelganger. The painting is called Flowers in the Meadow, and it was made by Swedish painter Carl Larsson before his death in 1919. Nothing unusual happened during their stay at the rural B&B. There was only one point in the night where Jenny woke to hear a strange papery sound as if someone was flipping through the pages of a book. They left in the morning and everything was fine, though the whole family was a little creeped out by the painting. The Shrunken Head. Up until the middle of the 20th century, isolated groups of people in the jungles of Ecuador and Peru created shrunken heads. One of these shrunken heads is currently stored in a museum in Canada. For years, researchers didn't know if it was a real human head or a fake. Most people at the museum assumed it was a fake head made from pig or sloth skin. But in 2022, a study revealed it to be the real deal. CT scans taken of the tiny head showed that it was once on the body of a Peruvian woman. But just how small is a shrunken head? The one in Canada is only 3.3 inches. It's known as a tanzas, believed by the indigenous peoples of the Amazon to contain the spirit of the dead. It was also believed that anyone who possessed the shrunken head of someone owned their spiritual power. Warriors would decapitate their enemies and shrink the head as a way to harness their spiritual life force. It was also thought that anyone who had their head shrunken would have their soul trapped within the head, thereby preventing them from having an afterlife. In the 19th century, counterfeit human heads became extremely lucrative commercially. Fakes were distributed that were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. Counterfeiters would use monkeys and pigs to make the tiny heads, then sell them for a big profit. Even though the indigenous people coveted shrunken heads as a source of power, many were willing to depart with them for the right price. European colonials were obsessed with purchasing the heads and bringing them back to Europe. The shrunken head in Canada was donated to the museum in the 1940s. It was purchased from a tribal family during a tour of the Amazon basin, but little else about it is known. As for how shrunken heads were made, that's an extremely disgusting process. The ceremony of shrinking a head was passed down from generation to generation. It started with taking the head off the body as close to the shoulders as possible. Then an incision was made from the top of the head to the bottom of the neck. Skin was peeled back until the epidermis was turned inside out. I won't go into any of the really ghoulish details, but essentially, the eyes were sewn shut, the head was cooled in water and simmered over a fire, then some hot stones were used, and boom! The head was shrunk to about 1/5 of its original size. Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. Chanchan statues. Chanchan was once the biggest city in the Americas and the capital of the Chimu civilization. Today it exists only in the form of ruins.
Located along the Pacific coast in northern Peru, near modern-day Trujillo, Chanchan consisted of some 10,000 structures during its heyday around 600 years ago. At its peak, the once wealthy city was home to an estimated 60,000 residents. It boasted elaborately decorated palaces and temples, streets, passageways, and walls as high as 30 feet. Perhaps the most exciting and creepy discovery at Chanchan happened in 2018, when archaeologists discovered 20 bizarre 800-year-old wooden statues lining a ceremonial corridor. Each statue measures roughly 27.5 inches tall, and one is female, which researchers say is very uncommon. Experts believe they marked the tombs of very important people. They are the oldest sculptures at the site and some of the oldest artifacts ever found there, period. Some are black with white clay masks, and each one has a circular object on its back that might be a shield. The corridor stretches over 100 feet, and these idols, all lined up in a row, still remain quite the mystery. When the Spanish arrived, they recorded seeing many precious metals around the city and even on the walls. There was a solid silver doorway that the Spanish took, which historians estimate would have been worth more than $2 million today. The Chimu Empire lasted from around 850 to 1470 AD, when the Incas conquered the civilization. Chanchan was left behind, and its remains are pretty damaged. El Niño storms happen much more often now than they did when Chanchan was inhabited, and the weather is taking an alarming toll on what's left of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Demonic jar. Archaeologists recently discovered an eerie 7,000-year-old bowl depicting a horned human face among the ruins of a Neolithic house in the village of Biskupice in southern Poland. We are not able to interpret what this type of figure meant, explains study leader Dr. Magdalena Moscal del Hoyo. It seems likely, however, that such an unusual artifact could be related to the sacred sphere to some extent. Additionally, archaeologist Marek Nowak mentioned that the bowl could potentially prove that the settlement's residents were in contact with prehistoric peoples from modern-day Hungary and Slovakia, as similar artifacts have been found in those countries. The unusual vessel fragment, as well as obsidian tools that were also found at the site, are made from materials that are unavailable in the region, suggesting that the items were imported from elsewhere. The bowl dates back to a time when Poland's first farmers inhabited the settlement and was found during emergency excavations prior to the construction of a new home. The site is associated with the mysterious linear pottery culture, which thrived from around 5,500 BC to 4,500 BC, and is best known for its simple pottery, as well as its role in the initial spread of agriculture across Europe. Besides this, little else is known about the culture or their artifacts. Plague mask. People protected themselves the best they could during past disease outbreaks, despite their limited knowledge about how germs spread and how to avoid getting sick. For a long time, nobody knew how the plague was transmitted, including doctors, but they tried nonetheless to shield themselves from it. One way they did this was by wearing a strange beaked mask that completely covered the person's face, including their eyes, which were shielded by glass lenses. The beak portion of the covering contained 2 small holes for breathing, as well as vinegar-soaked sponges or herbs, which people at the time believed filtered the diseased air. Since sick people smelled bad, it seemed like the disease was spread through the vapors. An authentic 16th century plague mask that is on display at the History Museum in Berlin represents the first such design of its type. It was intended to combat the miasma theory, which held that the plague was spread via bad winds or foul air. The mask was just one component of the getup that some doctors wore to prevent the plague from infecting them. They also donned a full body-length cloak-like garment and a wide-brimmed leather hat. To add to the already disturbing nature of the costume, doctors used a wooden stick to point to patients' body parts, take their pulse, and otherwise examine them from a safe distance. Not quite the answer, but it's true that all of this may have helped prevent them from catching the disease, even if they did look like something out of a nightmare and probably freaked out their patients. Roman hair. At the Yorkshire Museum in York, England, visitors have the opportunity to see an exceptionally rare Roman hairpiece dating back to sometime during the late 3rd or early 4th century. And of course, I mean hairpiece as in made of real hair. The auburn-colored bun was found with 2 hairpins in a stone coffin in May 1875, during the excavation of a Roman cemetery in anticipation of the construction of the York railway station. The coffin was lined with a lead sheet and filled with a plaster-like substance called gypsum. Researchers believe the hairpiece belonged to a young woman who died during her teens. Historical records support this idea, stating that the coffin contained the remains of a female whose hair had never reached full growth and was probably 15 or 16 years of age when she died. In the words of the Yorkshire Museum website, the basic hairstyle of a bun wound round at the back was a common style across the Roman Empire among the less fashion-conscious from the 1st century to the 5th. The hairpins that were discovered along with the faux hair, called cantharis headpins, are mostly specific to late Roman burials in York. Only a few examples have been found elsewhere, including in England and Europe. The head of a killer. Peter Kürten, better known as the Dusseldorf Vampire, committed a series of brutal murders in Dusseldorf, Germany during the early 20th century. He was finally caught in 1929 after a particularly heinous act resulting in a child's death. Altogether, Kürten confessed to at least 70 violent crimes, and he also admitted that he enjoyed drinking his victims' blood, hence the nickname Dusseldorf Vampire. He was executed by way of the guillotine on July 2, 1931, after consuming a last meal of Wiener Schnitzel, white wine, and fried potatoes the night before. In an attempt to understand his deranged mind, scientists bisected and mummified his head in the hopes of finding something physical that would explain what makes someone a murderer. To their surprise, they found no abnormalities in the man's brain other than an enlarged thymus gland, which certainly does not explain his behavior. Kürten's head ended up at Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin after World War II, where it remains on display to this day. A cursed children's toy. Within the walls of the historic Yeo House in Port Hill, Prince Edward Island, Canada, is a 19th century toy that has been described as a disfigured stuffed dog on wheels. Nicknamed Wheelie, the 150-year-old plaything is reportedly haunted and moves around on its own. Internet users became widely aware of Wheelie's existence earlier this year when the York Museum in England put out a call for other museums to share the world's creepiest archaeological artifacts as part of a series of curator battles. The allegedly possessed plaything was just one of many that establishments around the globe shared in participation of the virtual initiative. Despite this, Wheelie received international attention from the big-name news outlets, including The Guardian, CNN, and The Washington Post. Social media users were also fascinated by the toy. What was super interesting with this was with all this stiff, amazing competition from museums around the world, people seemed to just fall in love or become completely terrified by Wheelie, PEI Museum and Heritage Founder-Curator Matthew McRae told CBC, adding that people have asked if they can buy Wheelie t-shirts. The unexpected publicity that the PEI Museum received in response to Wheelie came as good news to McRae, who said that the foundation had recently received several hundred new followers on its social media accounts, versus the usual 25 to 50 per month. What do you think of Wheelie? Do you like it or hate it? Let me know in the comments below. Ancient clay head and skull. The Scythians were a large collective of mysterious ancient nomadic warrior cultures from modern-day southern Siberia, who ravaged rivals among the Eurasian steppe between 900 BC and 200 AD. While researchers admittedly have limited knowledge of these tribes, they know that the Scythians engaged in strange and bizarre death rituals, especially by modern standards. This much is clear based on the evidence that they left behind. In 1968, a team of Soviet archaeologists discovered a creepy clay head within an ancient Scythian burial in the mountains of southern Siberia. Estimated to be around 2,100 years old, the strange artifact was found among the charred remains of somewhere between 13 and 15 people. At first, researchers believed that the skull in question was human, but they eventually began to suspect otherwise, based on its shape. And in 2010, X-ray imaging revealed that the clay head contained a ram's skull. The item was found at a burial ground that experts believe belonged to the Tagarsk culture, one of the better studied Scythian tribes. It was considered an exceptional discovery, despite archaeologists having uncovered other fascinating objects from Scythian burials, including gold jewelry and weaponry. Scientists are unsure of what role the ram skull played in Scythian funerary rituals, but they have proposed some theories. Noting that rams were highly regarded by the region's ancient cultures, Russian archaeologist Natalia Polozmak suggested that it may have represented the soul and missing body of a man who drowned, became lost, or otherwise disappeared. But the plain and simple truth is that researchers truly don't know the story behind this strange artifact, and all they can do for now is speculate. Skull Tower of Nice. The Stele Kula, also known as the Skull Tower of Nice, was created from the decapitated skulls of 952 Serbian rebels in 1809 after a devastating defeat by the Turks. Turkish General Hershey Pasha commissioned the morbid 15-foot-tall, 13-foot-wide structure as a warning to anyone else who may have been tempted to go against his word. The Skull Tower was built during the Serbian Revolution, a widespread rebellion against the Ottoman Empire that lasted from 1804 to 1817. In 1809, in what became known as the First Serbian Uprising, it became clear to the vastly outnumbered Serbs that their options against the enemy were limited. With 36,000 Turks at their doorstep, it seemed that their only choices were to flee or surrender. But Commander Stefan Sindelic wasn't about to go down without a fight. In a last-ditch effort to take out as many Turks as possible and a final display of disrespect toward Pasha, he entered a fully stocked gunpowder room and fired a bullet into a gunpowder keg. Pasha was outraged and ordered his men to mutilate the dead rebels' corpses. The deceased soldiers' bodies were decapitated, and the heads were used to build the skull tower while their skins were stuffed with straw and sent to Istanbul as proof of Pasha's victory. Sindelic's skull is at the top of the tower, which originally consisted of 56 rows of 17 skulls each. The Serbs eventually drove out the Ottomans in 1878, and in 1892, the Serbian government built a chapel around the skull tower. Today, 59 of the skulls remain, as many were removed by the family members of fallen soldiers. The site attracts around 30,000 visitors annually. Castration clamps. Followers of the Greek fertility goddess Cybele, namely eunuch priests, marked their devotion to the deity through self-castration. To get the job done, they used an elaborately decorated set of castration clamps with serrated edges. One set, discovered in the Thames River during the 1840s, is adorned with the heads of the deities who presided over the 8-day Roman week, as well as a bull's head and a lion's head, according to archaeology blogger Roger Pierce, who notes on his website that the clamps in question likely date back to the 2nd or 3rd century and were probably made in Rome or somewhere else in Italy. He believes, based on a 1926 article about the disturbing device, that it currently is in the hands of the British Museum. Without going into too much detail, these types of clamps were used to prevent blood loss during the gory self-castration procedure, which continued until the 4th century, when authorities began to forbid this practice along with the rise of Christianity. In all fairness, there are arguably safer ways to worship the deity of your choice. Toothed tumors. In 2017, archaeologists in Lisbon, Portugal, announced the discovery of an ovarian tumor with teeth in a Gothic cemetery at the Church and Convent of Carmo. They found the artifact near the pelvic area of a 45-year-old woman's remains while excavating the site's 42 graves in 2010 and 2011. A subsequent study published in the International Journal of Paleopathology notes that the mass measures 1.7 inches at its widest point and contains evidence of disorganized bone formation, as well as 5 malformed teeth. The team believes that the calcified tumor dates back to sometime between the 15th century and 1755, when an earthquake destroyed the cemetery and church. At first, they were unsure of exactly what the object was, speculating that it was perhaps a fetus or an ectopic pregnancy. The researchers eventually determined that it was a type of cyst called a teratoma, which are actually rather common in today's world. But experts are still learning about the history of teratomas, and this off-putting but important discovery is helping them do so. Some types of tumors that are thought to be characteristic of modern societies and commonly attributed to Western civilization are also found in past populations, the study says. Teratomas, which comprise roughly 20% of all modern ovarian tumors, happen when germ cells multiply abnormally and form hair, teeth, bones, and other mature tissues. In many cases, they are benign, but these tumors sometimes become large, painful, and cancerous. It's unknown whether the teratoma played a role in the woman's death, but her skeleton seemed unaffected by it, according to the researchers. This is just one example of archaeologists discovering a teratoma. In 2013, a 1,600-year-old teratoma was found with a woman's remains at a Roman necropolis in Spain. Much like the more recent case in Portugal, it's unknown whether the tumor was benign or if it perhaps contributed to the woman's death. Thanks for watching! Hopefully this wasn't too creepy for you. What did you think was the scariest or the most disturbing? Would you like to learn more about creepy archaeological discoveries? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!